All right, great. So Mike's presentation reminded me, if you haven't seen it yet, one of the things we did for this event was to put together a book that isn't meant to be a comprehensive collection of all the stuff that came out of the lab, but it's really meant to be something, you know, you can take home. It's got a lot of pictures in it. It's got, you know, some lists of students and things like that. But it's also has a number of the papers that Mike mentioned and a bunch of other papers. We basically asked the faculty, you know, what papers would you like to highlight that have come out of the lab so far, you know, for this event. And what we did is we kind of took the first page of each of those papers. So there's about 40 of them that are in the book, and it's a nice way to kind of flip through. You can see the titles and the abstracts, and the authors, get an idea you get a feel for the kind of work that was going on in the lab without having to read 40 full papers. So, and then there's a QR code. If you want, you can click on it and get the full paper. So I'd encourage you to pick that book up outside if you haven't already. All right, so let's see if we can get this to work. All right. All right, so now what we're going to do, you know, as I mentioned, the lab had 3 directors, myself, Jan Stojka, and Mike Jordan. Mike has already said his piece, and now I'm going to say a little bit about the background of the lab, a little bit about the history, and then Jan is going to drill down on a bunch of the software that we built as part of the Berkeley Data Analytics stack. So let's see if I can get this to work. What I did with it. All right. Oh, there it is. So let's just do a little bit of the history of the lab. Let's see. Yeah, amazing. All right. So kind of in the pre-2008 period, there was a project going on called the Rad Lab, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And a lot of the initial ideas and kind of momentum for AMPLab came out of this earlier project. At the same time, and I wanted to make sure I said this while some people from the administration were here, Jan and I were actually not really around very much in the 2007-2008 period because we were off doing startup companies. And it was in that process of working on those companies, going out, you know, engaging very deeply with people across a bunch of different industries, that around 2007, 2008, you couldn't help but see the big data revolution starting to bubble up. I mean, everybody we spoke to was collecting more and more data. They were trying to figure out how to extract value from it. It was clear the existing solutions weren't good for that. And so when we all got back, you know, Jan and I got back, the Rad Lab was in the process of thinking about what to do next, and we started talking. It was pretty clear that there was something fundamental changing, and that we were a pretty good group to go after it. So towards the end of the Rad Lab, a couple of very relevant projects spun up. One is called Mesos, and you're going to hear today about the Mesos project and a company that has come out of Mesos called Mesosphere. Spark, you're going to hear quite a bit about. That was actually started in the Rad Lab as well. And we started having discussions about what we were going to do next at the end of the Rad Lab. And we should talk about this over beers tonight, but I believe, here's the way I remember it. I remember that we had a meeting with the Rad Lab faculty, and we said, hey, you know, there's this big data thing happening out there. It wasn't called that at the time necessarily. But let's go after that. We've got great machine learning people. We've got great systems people in the Rad Lab. Let's take those people and have them. Let's all go after this new project. And the first time we floated that idea, it was kind of met with kind of not a lot of enthusiasm. And so we ended up bringing in Hal Varian, who's chief economist at Google and for a long time a faculty member here at Berkeley, who was very excited about the potential for data analytics. Brought Hal in, had him talk to the Rad Lab faculty, and all of a sudden everyone got excited about it. So, you know, that's my recollection of how it started. Mike Jordan, who's not here to defend himself, claims that, oh, no, we knew we were going to do big data. Anyway, the other thing that happened around this time is we needed to come up with a name for the new lab. And I had been trying to come up with a few clever names that people like to call backronyms, you know, where you come up with a word and you try to figure out what it stands for. And I got a very stern lecture from Dave Patterson about the proper way of naming a lab, and that's not the way you do it. And the way you do it is you figure out what are the fundamental concepts of the lab, and then you build the acronym out of that. You don't go backwards. And so those are words to live by, but I learned that in 2009. And then in 2010, we started going around doing some initial fundraising. RadLab had been quite successful raising funds from industry partners, so we said, let's do that. And I had gotten a small grant from IBM for something else, and I said, hey, could I say it was for AMPLab? And they said, sure. So that was our first funding. And then we started talking actually to Google first, and we had a great reception from Google, and after they went through their process, they made a multi-million-dollar, multi-year commitment to the lab, which really got us going. Shortly after that, SAP decided to join. Amazon came in, and then you know, you'll see the list of sponsors that we ended up being able to bring in. So we did that. We also, around that time, got wind of the next round of proposals for something that the National Science Foundation runs called the Expeditions Project, where these are bigger than typical NSF computer science grants. They're 5 years, they're $10 million. They're very, very hard to get. But what we were doing, you know, what we wanted to work on seemed like a great fit for the expeditions, except we had one problem, which is we were doing the project completely at Berkeley, in fact, completely in Soda Hall. And we weren't sure if the expeditions required, you know, bigger kind of national collaborations. And so we spoke to people in NSF, and they said, no, you know, there's no requirement. You can do it sort of wherever, and it's really just based on the merits of the work. And so we applied for that, and as you'll see, you know, a year and a half later, we received it. And this was a fundamental contributor to the lab. It helped us really expand our scope. And as a result, Chaitan Baru from the NSF is here today, and he's going to talk a bit about how NSF is seeing big data and analytics and machine learning going forward. So that all happened then. We did a soft launch, and then 2011, we said, okay, we're starting our 5-year project. We did our first retreat, and then a year later, we got this 5-year award from NSF, so now we were a 6-year lab instead of a 5-year lab. And here we are at the end of those 6 years, and it's gone incredibly quickly. Just in context, you know, 2006 was the first release of the Hadoop open source version of MapReduce and the scalable file system. And then there was this explosion of software that started happening after that. You know, that was happening when the RadLab was going on, and as I mentioned, towards the end of RadLab, we started the Spark project, and you'll be hearing much more about that. But that led us into the AMPLab, and so we were basically, you know, just catching this wave of open source analytics software. And you can't read it, but Spark shows up here in 2012, which is towards the end of this particular picture. So, but this is what was going on in the industry. The way we pitched it to people is we said, okay, you know, there's big data. And these are slides from our original pitch deck in 2010 timeframe. So I actually didn't look at them too closely, so hopefully there's nothing embarrassing in here. But you know, it's big data. Data is incredibly dirty, comes from a lot of different places. And the questions that people are trying to ask and the answers they're trying to get out of this data are increasingly complex. And so it was a confluence of these 3 problems that we thought we needed to address. And so the way we came up with to address this was to say, okay, you have 3 main resources you can use to work with data. You can have algorithms, machine learning, statistical processing. In terms of machines, there's cluster computing, cloud computing. In the proposal, we talk about warehouse scale computing. And then people. And our original thoughts around people had to do with crowdsourcing platforms and citizen science and getting people to collect data for you. As we evolved, that turned into more sophisticated processing where people are doing data cleaning, they're answering questions that the algorithms are not doing a good job in, and so on. And so when you build this out, the idea was that you needed all 3 of these resources to really crack this problem. The other thing I'll mention about the booklet is we put in there the original proposal we wrote to NSF about what we wanted to do. So it's worth a look. At the end of the day today, we're going to have a panel where a bunch of the people involved in that proposal are grilled by Randy Katz, who was also involved in the proposal, about what we promised in there, what we actually delivered, and so on. And since NSF has already delivered all the funds, it's fine for Chaitin to stay in the room when we have that conversation. Okay, so this is what we're doing, algorithms, machines, and people. You'll hear more about it, so let's move on. And we basically made a bunch of bets that you can't solve this problem at small scale. You got to bring in, computer science systems people, machine learning people. You got to get them to work together. You got to co-design the entire stack, and that there were a bunch of things happening with systems that were kind of an inflection point. I'll talk about that in a minute. And this idea of bringing people into the mix was something that caught the imagination of a lot of the people who ended up sponsoring the lab, and was something that a lot of people, it wasn't really being said much at the time. You hear it a lot more now. And so Jan's going to talk about the software stack we built, but the basic idea was, you saw that list of that graph I showed with all the different software systems being created in the open source community. What was happening is people were taking the Hadoop idea and saying, hey, I want to do graph processing, so I'll build a system for that. Or I want to do streaming, so I'll build a system for that. Basically, people were building these stovepipe solutions to these different analytics problems. And AMPLab, we said, okay, let's take a different approach. Let's just make MapReduce more functional. Let's make it do more. And then we can build all of these different ways of working with data on a common substrate. That substrate is something now that's called Spark. And we were able to plug into the Spark system our relational query processing, streaming, graph processing, machine learning, and so on. And that's led to a lot of the adoption, a lot of the success of the Spark and the Berkeley Data Analytics stack. So we were lucky to hit an inflection point. There was widely available processing storage. Cloud vendors were allowing people to sort of pay as you go, so you didn't have to have a big capital outlay if you wanted to start doing data analytics. Software was changing to make it easier to ingest lots of data without having to do a lot of upfront design, like me and my colleagues here like to teach in the database class. People thinking about integrating lots of different ways of working with the data in their workflows, so it's not just query, it's not just search, but it's not just machine learning, but it's all of that stuff together. Machine learning was becoming more mainstream, and more sophisticated methods were being used in the industry. And as I mentioned, the idea of human-in-the-loop analytics was becoming more mainstream as well. And then finally, something that we were really able to leverage was the fact that a lot of the excitement in the big data space in industry was happening in open source. And so I don't want to, we can talk about that later in the day. I don't want to, but I can't sort of understress that open source allows universities and students at universities to play directly in the industry now. So when I was a graduate student, if you wrote a prototype, you'd shop it around to a few companies, and maybe they would look at it, maybe they wouldn't. Now that's been completely, the friction's been completely removed from that. If you're a graduate student, you're working on something interesting, you can put it up in GitHub, you can make a little noise about it, and you go directly to the people who might use it. And we were really able to leverage this in the AMPLab. When we, we had started this project, we were building systems, we started realizing something interesting was going on, and we started getting these hints. So this was something in late 2012 that had been published about all the companies that were in the big data space, and all of a sudden, if you looked in that upper right-hand corner, there was our little research project. And so that was interesting. The students, and you'll hear from some of the students involved in this, said, okay, let's see if we can build some community. So one of the things they did is they started a meetup group. There was one in San Francisco, started towards the end of 2012. We started getting a lot of interesting press, and so this is just a snapshot of some. One of my favorite quotes ever was this one right here about equating Berkeley with, I hope, the good parts of the Xerox PARC in terms of innovation. Ben Lorica, who's here, was a very early supporter of us and brought a lot of attention to our project. And Cloudera, Mike Olson is here. You'll hear from him. Very early on, saw what we were doing, saw value in it, and started rolling things out to their customers and gave us a lot of validation for what we were doing. Things started getting kind of crazy. This is a study that O'Reilly did where they looked at skills in job announcements and how much those jobs were paying and looked to see what were the most valuable things you could have on your resume to increase your salary. Number one was Spark. Somewhere around number 4 was the fact that you had a PhD. So for all the students in the audience, forget I said that, but and then you'll hear more from Jan, but this led to some of our software really going mainstream. And this morning, this is what the list of meetups looks like. There's almost 600 of them around the world, almost 300,000 members. So people who get together and talk about Spark and related systems around the world. One of the main things we were able to do was, have this public and private partnership, and we've had amazing support both from the typical sponsors, government sponsors of research, as well as all these companies that are represented here. Just to wrap up, let me just give you a few numbers. I believe we've graduated 39 PhDs so far, and there's a bunch more that are finishing up this year. Hundreds of papers, and some of them you'll see in the booklet. And what's really one of the interesting things in there is there's also a list of AMPLab publications at the top venues in machine learning systems and databases. And you can see that throughout the whole project, we've been extremely active in those venues. I talked about the meetup groups. There's thousands of people who contribute to the software in open source now. We raised $36 million over the course of the project, roughly half from government, half from industry. Our website was pretty popular. I looked this morning, 1.6 million visits since we put it up, not counting the couple months that our collection was down and we didn't notice. And as Jitendra mentioned, we've had ACM dissertation awards, we've had tons of best paper awards, best demo awards, and so on. And so in addition to the industry impact, lots of success in sort of traditional academic metrics as well. And as you'll hear later today, there's been a number of companies that spun out directly from the lab involving our students, as well as I know a lot of people here from companies are involved in companies where they have products that at least use or maybe even just bundle some of the software that our students have built. So with that, I think I would like to turn things over to Jan, because I think we're already running late. So let me see, did I have anything else? Yeah, I was going to talk about how we follow Dave Patterson's lessons on how to build a good research center. And so let me just build that out quickly so you can see it. Cross-disciplinary team, really work together and in fact even sit together. Engage very early with industry, build software and let people use it early. And then the reason we're all here today is, start the project with an end date in mind so that you're focused, you're on a schedule, and you know when it's time to move on to something new. So with that, I just wanted to thank everybody for being here. I'm going to turn things over to Jan, who's going to tell you a little more about our software.